on your behalf. Then we will have a brief facilitated discussion in breakout rooms, which will not be recorded. And at today's workshop, we will look at the climate path we are on and explore how community developers can alter that path to create a more sustainable future. We'll hear from a climate thought leader about the challenges we face and the choices we confront. We'll also hear from 2 CDCs about what they are doing to address the climate crisis, keeping the needs of vulnerable communities at the forefront. Meeting participants will also get the chance to share information about their climate work. I'm honored to introduce our speakers today. First, we have Latifa Ziad, is the East Boston Resiliency Planning Coordinator at Neighborhood of Affordable Housing. She was the first Director of Economic Development for MACDC, the first Muslim woman board president of a major interfaith social justice organization, and the first resilience coordinator for the New England Aquarium. Latifa has won local, regional, and national grants, including the Showcase Community Designation from the EPA. Next, we have Melinda Vega. Melinda is the Community Building and Engagement Coordinator at NOAA and a lifelong resident of Chelsea. She was the youngest to serve on an elected school committee member for the City of Chelsea and is currently the Chelsea City Councilor for District 2 and running for re-election this year. At NOAA, she coordinates the Youth Organizers Program and also empowers East Boston community members by developing leadership skills. Dr. Nathan Phillips is a professor and physiological ecologist in the Department of Earth and Environment at Boston University. Nathan is one of the country's leading researchers in methane emissions from natural gas leaks under urban streets. Nathan serves on the advisory board for the Home Energy Efficiency Team. He works with advocates, community members, and policymakers to apply his research to advance sustainable communities and a habitable planet. Last but not least, we have Leslie Melendez, the Deputy Director at Groundwork Lawrence. She is a change agent, facilitator, and organizer. As a community weaver, Leslie brings her passion for collaboration, community, and equity to the forefront of her work of green space improvement, fresh food access programs, youth and adult education and employment opportunities, and community programming. Nominated by Representative Frank Morin, Leslie was selected by the Massachusetts Commission on the Status of Women as an Unsung Heroine of 2017. Thank you to our wonderful speakers for volunteering their time today. And with that, I will pass it over to Latifa and Melinda from NOAA.
Oh. Hi everyone, my name is Melinda Vega Maldonado. I am the Community Building and Environment Coordinator. First and foremost, I'm going to ask you guys to bear with me. I'm not feeling that great and my voice is coming in and out. So I just want to say thank you for having us. Latifa, you want to?
My name is Latifa Ziad. Melinda's going to go first and set up the history for us, and then I'm going to follow through with some specifics that we're looking forward to the future, looking forward to talking.
Okay, so let me begin. Great. Hold on, I'm trying to share the screen here. It's not letting me. I'm having a hard time sharing the screen. It's not allowing me to.
Do you want me to try to share the
Sure.
slide that you sent to me? Hopefully this will work. And assuming it does work, you can just let me know when to change slides. So let's see. Hopefully I can do this right. There's
Don, I have it open if you want me to do
yes.
it.
Thank you, Neha. Did you get the revised version from great. Thank you, Neha. Go for it.
All right, can everyone see?
Yes. So learning ABCDs of environmental justice of EJ. You can go on to the next slide. I'm going to begin with the history of the fundamentals of where we started. Here is a picture of our Chelsea Creek. For those that know Noah and our work, know that the Chelsea Creek is something that is very important to us because it defines how we started through our grassroots organizing and fighting for environmental justice. This picture shows basically this is the Chelsea Creek, and this shows the inequities that we've had to fight for throughout our years of organizing when we started in the early 2000s. Environmental justice for me, as I define it, is a fair distribution of environmental benefits and burdens, regardless of race, income, and culture. And that's something that is extremely important to us and has driven our work throughout the years. The Chelsea Creek is the home of all of the jet fuel of the airport. We are the second most industrialized waterfront in Massachusetts. Both Chelsea and East Boston are peninsulas. I'm just describing to you so that you have an idea of what we've had to deal with in terms of the environmental burdens. So as I described, both Chelsea and East Boston are peninsulas, but we don't have access, or we haven't always had access to the waterfront. And growing up, I live in Chelsea. Growing up in Chelsea, it wasn't, always, if you drive through, it's not visible. Our water isn't visible because of all the industries on the waterfront. So years ago, we had our water quality was a grade F, so it's not swimmable, boatable, fishable, or any of that. But through our organizing, empowering people on both Chelsea, East Boston, we have worked towards the betterment of our Chelsea Creek. And now we are at a C+, which makes it that we can go canoeing in it. And so for folks that know this, in East Boston, we do a lot of kayaking on our water and so forth. If you want something, one of our campaigns on the Chelsea Creek in our victories was the Conda Street Urban Wild. We host a lot of events there on the East Boston side, and that's the first waterfront access that we have, park that we have right on the Chelsea Creek. And that was a youth-led campaign that we raised over $1 million to make sure that we had it, because, through our years of organizing way back when Mayor Menino was mayor, he had told us that it was, we couldn't have the Urban Wilds be a park because he didn't have enough funding. And so, but because through our organizing, through petitioning and door knocking and canvassing and being in his office and, basically harassing him and continuously doing organizing work, he said to us, if you are this eager and persistent, I bet that you guys can raise money. And within that year, that was our goal. And not only, and he said, if you are able to raise money, I will match the money that you have. So I have a $400,000 budget, and we not only doubled it, but we raised over $1 million. So that is the Condo Street Urban Wild that we do a lot of stewarding now, the Chelsea Creek. If you want to go on to the next slide. So as I've described to you, a lot of our work is through our organizing, and our environmental justice issues have evolved now, more so through, now we do more climate justice work as well. When I came back to NOAA, one of the things that we did in 2016 or 2017 was our Youth and Adult Climate Summit. These pictures here on your right-hand side is our climate summit for both our, and then the bottom are is the youth group that led the summit that year. And in these summits, we had discussions about our climate resilience work and focus a lot on the Climate Ready East Boston Phase 1 plan. And one of the things that came up in that climate summit was that it was great that the city took this on, but there was criticism on the lack of community engagement and the Latino participation, as well as the fact that only it was in one specific area in East Boston. And so one of the things that came out of the summits were that we wanted to do something more intense and ensure, I apologize, and ensure that we are being just or justo when it comes to language. And so we decided to do the charrette, which is the second point. And in the charrette is when we defined 3 different zones that were the highest with that we have tons of flooding. And the climate leaders, our climate delegates, identified them as areas that we needed to focus on. And so the charrette event was a 3-day event that we had, where the first day our youth did environmental justice tours and went to the sites and showed the community members visibly what we were looking at and discussed what things we would possibly like to see in terms of climate resilience and flood prevention work, and then in infrastructure, and then the 2 following days was when we sat, and when I say we, I mean our community leaders, both English and Spanish speakers, were divided. And this is the first time that I would say, as a Latina, as an organizer, I felt comfortable separating the groups. And we were very intentional because we didn't want anything to get lost in translation. And we wanted to make sure that the community members felt comfortable speaking their language. And so we did a visioning session, and we basically designed what they would like to see along these zones. And so in that picture to your left, those are different things that the community members defined. And one of the things that I want to ensure that I mention is that we, in the charrette, we ensured that we had technical support, so that were both English and Spanish speakers. And so when we divided the groups, the Spanish speakers had technical support and designers basically listening, and were drawing up in real time the designs that they wanted to see. And this was something that we got really, really good feedback. When we finalized the 3-day event, we then created a report, and then we had an event and we did like a report back that summarized what it was that our community wanted in these 3 zones. And now we're working with the city to implement these processes currently now. Lastly, one thing that I want to describe is our survey that took place right before COVID hit. And this was a year-long process where our youth led, and we knocked on doors, and we partnered with NYU. And during the surveys, our youth, the surveys were questions about emergency preparedness and what our East Boston community knew about climate, and how prepared did they feel in terms of climate emergencies, or ¿cómo se dice? I would say catastrophes. So for example, when we had those rainstorms, the Bombo Genesis a few years back, we weren't prepared. And I would say that there was flooding on both sides of the creek, and it was so bad. My husband is a Chelsea police officer, and he was getting phone calls of people along, on Marginal Street, which is the Chelsea side of the water front, having to be picked up because they were stranded on top of their cars. And we had a lot of folks on the East Boston side that, unfortunately, if they lived in basements in the waterfront area, their homes were completely flooded. And so these were things that we have to think about and prepare for. One of the things that we also highlight is one of the spots or a shelter in place is in a flood zone. So we need to ensure that we update these maps and communicate with the city and ensure that that location is not one of the zones. So for the surveys, we knocked on 267 doors. And we got a lot of really good feedback, and I just got a note that I'm going to turn it to Latifah because we have about 4 minutes. So sorry, Latifah, I took a little bit of your time.
It's great. It was really comprehensive. Thank you for changing the slides. So out of those 270 surveys, what was really clear out of this summit, what was really clear is that they needed to have somebody on the ground who paid complete attention to this. Thus, I was hired into this work as a resiliency coordinator. So I'm the fruit of all of those surveys that happened. And as a result of that, I have been able to kind of peer down and really ride the wave of resources that have been kind of low-lying fruit that emerged out of COVID. So I think all of this is really relevant to the times. And so there's this really cute buzzword, resilience, that everybody funds, everybody pays attention to. And if you look at its definition, just if you Google it, you'd see it's the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, toughness, right? And anyone who knows anything about the track record of NOAA, led by Phil Giffey, tough is what we are, 34 years of history. So that ruggedness is how we apply the work that we do in this resiliency space. And we're not only looking at resiliency as surviving through these eras of toughness, but actually using these chaos moments as momentum feeders to bounce forward. So whatever we were dealing with as frameworks in the past really needed to be shaken up and rattled up. And we needed to now use this to bounce forward into even a better future. And that is exactly what we have done. instead of looking at resilience as just a climate issue, because prior to me coming to NOAA, I was actually on the ground in East Boston working with the New England Aquarium, doing resiliency work on behalf of the New England Aquarium with many of the localized groups that were already working on climate change. So it was a nice lateral transition for me to come into this work, where I had already done 2 years of on the ground communication with all the players in the midst of the issue. So it was really a good way, and it's one of our first ABCs, awareness, paying attention to what's happening. Not only did we do those surveys and we knew what people wanted, but because we were on the ground networking, we knew perfect places to connect for the next stages. So that's our first A in our ABCs. So when I hit the ground working, one of the key things that happened is I had to look at the landscape that was already in place. And we were part of a group called the Belle Isle Marsh. You can't do this work in a silo. It is a collaborative function, thus the C in our ABCs, collaboration. And we looked, and there was an issue of CSOs, which happened to be from my graduate work 20 so years ago, or 30 years ago. CSOs was actually my theory paper in New England. So we zoomed in on the CSO. It had been an ongoing issue with the Belle Isle Marsh group, particularly one of the lead organizations in that group. But because NOAA, having a big footprint, hadn't really put its work into that area, it kind of just kept lingering. As soon as NOAA started paying attention, and we wrote a letter to the mayor, we circled the wagons on this, all of a sudden this issue bellowed up to the top of attention. So CDCs can play a really key role on zooming in on an issue and tilting the a type of attention and space it is on the Richter scale of importance. So we played that role as a trigger for that work, in which we then ended up organizing, meeting with Commissioner Brazius, talking with Hamariyama, sending information to her to make this issue for paramount. Because there were 7 CSOs in the Boston area, and we had one that was a really key CSO in our backyard that's just leaking sewage. And this is something that has become, it's on the Boston Water Sewers importance, but it had become even more important as groups locally have paid attention to it, because we don't know how much longer it would have just kind of been in a back file somewhere. And then also the Eversource group, of course, Green Roots on the ground in Chelsea is kind of leading the effort with Eversource, but in the coalition, we're able to add dynamic to that effort. And of course, just recently, it was, if you were voting in Boston, it was a citywide ballot. And now that we've gotten approval for most of the city to say, we don't want the Eversource energy spaces in East Boston, that substation, now it's been given a new thrust of attention as well in that way. So coalition building is huge in this work. Also, what we did is, because of the COVID-19 space, a lot of resources have been shaken. And because we have that wide lens on resilience, we were able to say, well, you can't talk to people in East Boston if they don't have the resources to receive it. So we were able to write and receive a digital divide grant so that we can provide free internet, free computers for folks, so that we can even have conversations like we're having right now, a virtual conversation in East. We were also able to look at what was happening in the airport. For years, folks talk about, the asthma that is risen on residences around those areas and commercial spaces around those areas. Melinda talked about Condor Park that is right in you can see the jet fuel coming out of the plane as the young people in the park. So it's really like a serious issue. And so what we were able to do was organize with businesses, schools, and residences to, and this is all future again, put sensors into some of those spaces, then follow those up with HEPA filters to see what the difference is made in those spaces. So we're going to be doing that with 40 spaces in and around the airport in both residential, school, and business areas. And then food insecurity. When I came in, again, resiliency is you can't have a conversation with people unless, you know, they're fed and now they're able to kind of talk to you. So although I thought my work was specifically going to be hitting the ground, working on climate issues, and we are building the Climate Resilience Network as part of this, what we did is immediately we organized, I think, $150,000 worth of resources from the city through the Boston Resiliency Fund to put 200,000 pounds of food through a relationship with, again, Chelsea, looking at the region, La Colaborativa. So for weeks, people would be able to come and get roughly 50 pounds each of food. We did about 1,500 families that way. But not only did we do that, what we were recently able to do was get the destigmatization grant from the city and then build our resiliency work in the destigmatization grant. So we're going to do a series of 6 concerts in Boston, in the Central Park area in a park. And each of those concerts are rooted in either a day or a month theme. So we're going to kick it off with Earth Day, and we're going to end it with Climate Resilience Month in September. And each month we're going to have someone who comes up to the stage that talks about how they survived through a difficult time, who is either an influencer or a politician. We're going to have food demos on the stage, and we're going to build our resiliency network in coalition again with CREW, the communities resource for extreme weather. So if we could just change slides so I can close it up. Okay, so if you listen to what I said, we talked about awareness through our surveys and through on-the-ground networking. We had to be bold about our vision, about doing things before anyone else did it. We had to build collaborative efforts because you can't do this in a silo. It's a work in progress with many folks that play critical roles in their own spaces. And then you have to be driven to finish this work because you're going to face many bumps along that way. So I want to thank MACDC for amplifying this work. And I'm going to turn it over back to MACDC for the next CDC to talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Latifa, and thank you, Melinda. Well, just to say, we're going to let all the presenters speak, and then we're going to take questions after they've all spoken. So if you have questions at any time, please put them in the chat, and we will get to them after all the presentations. Thank you. So Nathan, turn over to you.
Hi, can you see my screen?
We don't see your slides.
Okay, let me pull them up. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
We can hear you. Yes.
Okay, great. Yep, these should be loading now, hopefully. All right, can you see slides?
Yes,
Okay, and you can hear me well?
we can.
Okay, thanks. So thank you, Melinda and Latifa, for teeing up the issues really well. The words that you used and the themes on resilience, catastrophes and chaos, and bouncing back and applying lessons learned from those really feed right into my remarks here. And I know I'm starting off with a really harrowing slide here and a very difficult story to tell. It's traumatic. People from the Merrimack Valley in this session were traumatized, and yet we can't forget about events that happened on September 13th, 2018 in North Andover, and the community of Lawrence. So this may not seem like a climate change type of issue, because what we had here was a catastrophe that was caused by a combination of human error and a control system error back in a control center in Ohio. But I'm wanting to get right to my main takeaway point, and that is that the systems that undergird our communities and our homes, that are highly centralized, they engender vulnerabilities, and they also drive the climate crisis that makes us in turn more vulnerable to impacts. And so that's the theme that I'm going to really touch on here today, but also that we have solutions and they are actually being implemented today. So there is a good outcome there can be when we apply lessons learned from very, very difficult and bad situations like we saw there. So I just want to quickly go through the story of how I got involved. I had been and have been studying the problems and issues with gas infrastructure for the last decade. And so when the events of September 2018 occurred in the Merrimack Valley, some of us sprung into action because we knew that there were some temporary electric-based solutions. The electricity came back on within 24 hours after the gas outage that plunged 8,300 households into cold. And so we began delivering induction cooktops. These are electric, clean cooktops. So at least that could provide a little bit of relief to the people that were beleaguered and struggling during that time period. A few days later, the same thing happened with the National Guard and Columbia Gas. They began passing out thousands of hot plates and space heaters, but there was a big problem. And that was that no one knew which households had the basic electric capacity to be able to plug these things in without tripping circuits or even worse, creating fire hazards. And so that's a big lesson that everyone was confronted with, was we weren't prepared for this disaster. And I'm going to come back to the lesson learned from that recognition of a problem. But first, I want to just rapid fire go through some slides and show you that this is not, although that was such a catastrophic event, these kinds of outages are not as uncommon as you might think. Slides are a little bit slow here in moving. Not sure why. Okay, so I'll just say that, my next few slides here are just a rapid fire set of headlines, some before the Merrimack Valley gas disaster, some after, where there were outages in the gas system, single point failures where sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands of households were without, let's see, live broadcast has stopped. Okay, can you hear me and can you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, great.
I'm sharing your slides now so that you can just focus on speaking.
Excellent, thank you so much. So here's one from January 2019 in Rhode Island, at Quidneck Island. 7,300 households plunged into darkness into cold in the middle of winter. Next slide. Am I advancing these or are you, Neha?
I'm advancing them. Is this the right one?
Yeah, I guess I'm not seeing them advance on my end. Okay, so yeah, so I can't see where we are in the slides.
Well,
maybe
Nathan,
I need to stop sharing my screen.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, all right. So
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so you're seeing these headlines and these articles pass by. And so that's just my point, is that these are more common outcomes than you might think, or events than you might think. And if we are at the slide where we see Atlantic Avenue flooded, my point is that we also have these impacts of climate change coming at us, as in East Boston, as in Chelsea, and so many areas along our coast. We are now facing situations where we're getting inundation. And so we see that in places like Saugus, we actually have the gas pipelines being inundated, the meters filling with water. And so it's coming full circle. The drivers of the climate crisis that are putting us more at vulnerability are feeding back. Okay, so I'm gonna unshare, let's see, share. Okay, I've stopped sharing, I think. So we should be, hopefully, yeah, we're on Neha's screen. I'm not sure why this is advancing so slowly. I apologize for that. And so let's see, whether we can just get down to where we have the policy solution slide. Right. So we do. So let's talk about solutions now for a moment, because I've just, you know, inundated you in a way with so many of these different problems. But we have funding programs like the Massachusetts Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, in which we can actually proactively address and prepare and build that resilience, apply those lessons learned. And so next slide, I'll just give you an example of how we've done that with this project called Energy Shift, and that's with the organization HEAT that I had mentioned, Mothers Out Front as well. And so we engaged communities in Boston in this project that was funded by the Sasaki Foundation last year to share with people in their houses and in other houses, like, here's an alternative cooking method to gas. Here's what your electric panel looks like, whether you're a owner or renter, you know, and this is how much electricity you can take. If there is a gas outage, here are your options for using electricity. And we've worked with the municipal government. Matt O'Malley in Boston was a great champion of this work, and working with communities as well, and shown that there's a lot of possibility for communities to get together as a community and to understand what their individual and collective resilience is to energy shocks in the gas system. Next slide. And so this has led to an even bigger kind of solution that we have been working on, where we can shift our energy off of gas altogether in communities that would like this option. And that involves really a strategic and managed way to take ourselves off of our leaking gas infrastructure, which ratepayers are looking at in Massachusetts are looking at $20 billion if we want to replace the gas system that we actually know that we have to move off of by 2050 to meet our climate goals. And so if we can tap into the clean energy, thermal energy in the earth or in the air just outside of our homes and buildings, that is localizing energy. And this is a way that we can do it. So this diagram here shows how we could take one block, let's say it's a neighborhood block that's on it has an old 100-year-old gas pipeline. Instead of replacing that gas pipeline with another pipeline, could we not use that same right of way, that same grant of location to put in a geothermal system that taps into the thermal energy of the earth? It's not like volcanoes or molten rock. It's just the 55-degree stable temperature 100 feet below the earth, and serve all the homes and buildings on that block. And then if we go to the next slide, this is a scalable solution that can back our way upstream, next slide, in the gas system and progressively retract and transition this gas system to a clean, electrically driven, localized thermal grid. Next slide. And that takes it to scale. And I know it probably sounds quite incredible to you. And what's even more incredible to me is that it's actually happening. And I give major credit to the folks over at HEAT, the home energy efficiency team. They've managed to work with the investor-owned utilities like Eversource, like National Grid, in order to get them thinking about moving in this direction. And next slide. And they're actually doing that. So Eversource has demonstration projects planned for what we call the geogrids. So does National Grid. In addition to that, as part of the gas explosion renewable fund to the Merrimack Valley that went along with the purchase of Columbia Gas by Eversource, there's a $4 million allocation to actually put one of these geogrids into an appropriate location in Lawrence. So that is so exciting to me that this is actually happening. Next slide. We have tough decisions to make about our energy future, because although Eversource, National Grid, and others are doing the right thing in looking at and actually implementing these clean energy solutions, at the same time, they're proposing other projects, very high price tag projects that would take us back and really double down on the status quo. So one of those is in a frontline community of Springfield. They want to build I've heard it to be $44 million. I think they're saying it's $33 million here. New pipeline that would go from Long Meadow into Springfield. And it's really in the name of reliability and resilience. And I think we really need to interrogate that concept of what is resilience, what is reliability, and does doubling down on a gas system, literally doubling down by putting in a double pipeline, really get us to where we need to be or not? Next slide. And I'll just actually bypass this slide. It gets at the same questions. And I just want to kind of, really say that the technical things that I've talked about, the lessons that we saw, the lessons learned, and the solutions, those are technical solutions, but I want to just underscore that the main challenge and the main opportunity we face, it's a societal shift. And I heard that in the comments from the two previous speakers. It's about engaging the community. It's about understanding the social networks that are there and building the social resilience, because when we get together as communities, we can be intentional and think about these solutions and decide to go forward on them. Next slide. And I just want to thank the partners that worked and supported this, and I will turn it back over to our hosts. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. And now turn it over to Leslie.
Thank you. Thank you, Nathan and Melinda and Latifa. Great information, and really setting the stage for what I'm going to talk about next. And it's really about what Groundwork does to implement some of these things that we're talking about in theory, that we have talked about in terms of climate and where we're going. So let's see if it works to share my screen, because I know everyone else has had a bit of a challenge. Right. And there we go. All right, well, thank you all for joining us today. Again, my name is Leslie Melendez, and I'm the Deputy Director at Groundwork Lawrence. Groundwork Lawrence is part of a larger network that is spread throughout the United States, and there are 23 trusts across the Commonwealth, 3 of them right here in Massachusetts, Lawrence, Somerville, and South Coast, which is Fall River and New Bedford. And the premise of the Groundwork model, which comes from the UK, is really to think about youth and brownfields. And in all of the communities that we are in across the country, it really is, they're all communities that have had challenges around environmental justice issues that relate to brownfields. And as we've been doing this work for over 20 years, have completely looked at the shift in terms of what climate change is and how it's affecting our communities. So one of the ways we talk about this, and one of the ways that we do this work here in Lawrence, is by transforming our green spaces and any other spaces that we can get our hands on to be able to do that. Lawrence is a very small in terms of geographical size. It's only 7 square miles with 3 rivers running through it. But we have over 100,000 people, close to over 100,000 people living within its confines. So there's a lot of challenge around being able to build but also being able to preserve the very few open spaces that we do have. We have approximately 45 parks that range in size from 1,200 square feet to 17 acres. So we need to make sure that as we're doing this work and we're talking to the community and hearing from them what they want to see and do, that we're infusing the conversation around climate change. And for those of us who have been in this work for a really long time, having conversations around climate change with a population that is inherently disregarded and is below poverty level and has so many other inequities that they have to deal with, climate change to them is something that is kind of far off in the ether. So we had to figure out how to have these conversations with folks. We had to figure out how to directly tie climate change and the effects of climate change and environmental justice to the bottom line, to their bottom line, and how it affects them. So as we've been doing this work over 20 years, you know, Lawrence, again, is a product of the Industrial Revolution. We had lots of mills here in the city, lots of mills that burnt down, lots of spaces that were contaminated and that needed love and attention. And Groundwork Lawrence has always been that catalyst / facilitator, project manager when it comes to taking over these spaces and making them green space. So if you see this space, this is a 2.7 acre vacant lot that was behind one of the densest neighborhoods in the city of Lawrence and abutted a river. So the Spicket River is the river in the northern part of the city. And it was channelized back in the 1800s to facilitate moving trash down the river from one end of Lawrence to the other. But what it did was that then it created this issue where flood storage was a problem. So there wasn't enough green space along the river to be able to handle all the water that comes sheeting off of all of these, you know, flat roofs across the city. So we focused really hard on making sure that, one, we were protecting the green spaces again, but two, we were developing as many vacant lots into green spaces so that we could continue having these conversations around how important it was to have open space, to have trees, and to really think about what folks were doing on their own properties to facilitate the flooding issue. So this is what the park looks like now. We were able to reclaim the space. There are community gardens there. There's a beautiful, huge lawn there, and the playground for the youth in the neighborhood to be able to play. Because one of the things that we have been doing for over 20 years is that all of our work is community driven. So this project actually came about because a neighbor talked to a friend and said, hey, you know, what's gonna happen back there? What is the city doing back there? And they said, well, we should talk to people who know about this stuff. And through personal relationships, they came to Groundwork Lawrence. This park was actually designed in someone's living room. We brought a landscape architect into the person's living room. She invited her neighbors, provided coffee and snacks, and we had this conversation around why it was so important for this to be green space versus for this to be housing. We also worked on this, again, back to the Spicket River, worked on the Spicket River Greenway, which is a 3.5 mile greenway that goes from the northernmost border of the city and brings you right down to the Merrimack. And it became a way for people to do non-traditional transportation through the city, so biking and walking, and still being able to observe some of these beautiful views. One of the important things about this is that we were able to reclaim, yet again, some green space and add a lot of trees in the area. And folks weren't used to having these nice things in their backyard. The Spicket River was always seen as one of those places that just was not inviting. And what this process proved was that if folks dared to dream and talk about their dreams and share their dreams, that these things could actually happen. And it was a form of community engagement and community empowerment that we hadn't seen here in Lawrence before, but that we were able to tap into to be able to move forward with some of our other resiliency work. Our tree planting programs have been small and steady up until a few years ago when we were able to get a grant from the state called Greening the Gateway Cities, and to date have planted over 2,000 trees within a 500-acre area. And that was a big challenge here in a community where, as Melinda can attest to, every single space is considered precious in terms of parking because there isn't a lot of space. In terms of elevating oneself, one's status, right? You have this beautiful space, you can create parking for yourself and for your tenants. But what folks weren't realizing is that by paving everything over, they were creating more challenges for themselves as homeowners. And that is one of the ways that we were able to talk to folks in terms of that bottom line that I referenced earlier about what it meant to have trees, what it meant to really look at climate change in a way that affected them daily. And it's all about collaboration and partnership, right? This work would not happen. We don't do, as Latifa mentioned, we don't do this work in a silo either. We partner with our city, with the municipal officials, we partner with our residents, we partner with businesses and corporations to do service days and to really bring to light some of the issues and get the support that is needed to really work through some of the things that you see here. This picture was taken actually probably about 7 years ago now, because the river doesn't look like that anymore, but that's because folks have been really involved in making sure that their city is clean and that their city is moving in the direction of making sure that we all have what we need to have a safe and wonderful life. And all of this ties back into the work that we do overall. We have lots of program areas and I won't dive deep into all of them, but youth and jobs, youth education and jobs is clear. It's very important. It's been made very clear that it's very important. Our youth are the ones that are going to be taking up this mantle when those of us who have been doing this work for a really long time decide to retire, right? They are the ones that are taking the time to care about what's happening in their environment. They are the ones that are taking the time to learn. And we, as the adults in their lives and as the folks who are doing this work, need to make sure that we're giving them that space, that we're allowing them to learn and to ask questions, right? A lot of the work that we do with our youth is youth-centered. It's that youth voice. We don't make these decisions around programming in a way that we know what's best for them, because you know what? We don't know what's best for them. We know what's best in terms of what we can do with the money that we have, right? There's limits and boundaries and all of that, but having them be the voice of the program, having them decide where they want to focus their time and energy so that they can make an impact and continue doing this work is extremely important. And I think my screen froze. Oh no, there we go. We also know that, this also has to be a resident-led initiative. I can go out and talk till I'm blue in the face and talk about all of these things that'll help the environment and the community, but it really needs to be resident-driven. It needs to be that our youth are going out there and speaking to their friends and their families, but that that there are also residents in the community that are really taking up this fight. So we partnered with CLF, Conservation Law Foundation, and were awarded a Robert Wood Johnson grant to look at resilient corridors and to look at how people are moving throughout the city, to identify some of those, some of those routes in those corridors, and to really think about how we shift transportation. Lawrence, again, is only 7 square miles and was truly built as a walking city. It was not built to have over 35,000 registered vehicles in the city, right? That's not where we were back then in the 1800s, but it is where we are today. So how do we make sure that that we're shifting the way people think about transportation in the city? And then just kind of the impact of groundwork and what we've been doing over the years. We have, in partnership with the city and foundations and private funders, done over $25 million of improvements to our open spaces. Out of those 45 parks, we've touched 23 in terms of rebuilding playgrounds, planting trees, sometimes redeveloping the entire space, We have 11 community gardens with over 150 community gardeners, and do a lot of work with them so that they can understand the importance of urban agriculture in climate change and how that supports, both things support each other. Over 6 miles of trails, and like I said, over 2,400 trees planted. That's a lot, and I've said a lot, and I'm happy to answer any questions when it's time for questions, or to have a more in-depth conversation in terms of what we do when we go into our breakout rooms. But all of that to say that the work that Groundwork Lawrence has been doing for over 20 years really is based in community and climate change and public health. Those are the 3 areas, right? We are a public health organization that focuses in on how we can support the work that community residents want to do around these topics. Just a little kind of, this is what we've done over the year, kind of annual numbers. And these obviously fluctuate as we've been in COVID for over 20 months. We haven't really been in schools. We actually just returned to the school program in September. We were fortunate enough where we were able to continue keeping our Green Team youth on and paying them throughout the time, and understanding how important that was. And that's a wrap. This is my contact information, but I'll turn it back over to Don and Neha.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie, and our presenters. So we do have a few time for questions. So Leah, do you want to ask your question that you put in the chat?
Sure. My question was just for Leslie. As we've seen with COP26 and all of the kind of news in the past, in the very recent past, it's climate change and resilience has been much more in the public perception. So have you experienced at your organization any like more donorship or more interest or more community partnerships coming from that?
Absolutely. We've actually gotten an uptick in requests from other organizations to partner in terms of they recognize that community engagement and empowerment is so important to get some of this work done, that they aren't trying to recreate a wheel. They understand that we do that and we do it really well. So they want to partner with us so that we can do that work together. I also have seen a change in the way funders and are thinking about some of this in terms of how regimented some funders are, right? In terms of metrics and all of that, and in that shift in philosophy and in thinking about, well, if we support the organization, instead of supporting a program within the organization or making an organization create a new program, if we're supporting the organization as a whole in this work, we're going to see that impact that we're looking for. So it's not all funders, it's a small group of funders that are starting to have that shift, but it's starting to happen. So we're definitely seeing a lot more of it now because of all the work that's happening around the globe on this small scale. We definitely are seeing a lot more youth interested and wanting to become involved as well.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you for your question. There is first of all, I'm Don Bianchi from MACDC, if anybody doesn't know me. We have a question from Alice Wong of MHP. Alice, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, I'm only on the phone. Is that all right?
That's fine, Alice. Go for it.
Great. Would the speakers talk about what I worry about the regressive impact on low-income households as we move from electricity to away from fossil fuels? Or how do we talk about this equitably?
Anyone can speak to that question, please.
Yeah,
I'm happy to jump in and start. I think one of the things that we're seeing here in Lawrence is making sure that we're at the table to have these conversations with the folks like Eversource and National Grid. But one of the ways that we're talking to folks about especially their electricity bill in the summer, that's actually one of the things that we use when we're talking about trees and talking about having trees on their property, right? And how the shade from the trees helps with lowering those electricity costs. If we think about what happened in Worcester when the longhorn Asian beetle attacked and over 30,000 trees had to be taken down. And the cost of electricity skyrocketed in those neighborhoods, right? The cost to the consumer skyrocketed in those neighborhoods. And there was that direct correlation of the fact that there weren't that many trees anymore. And, that's part of how we talk about this. And I will tell you that it's not an easy conversation. Alice, it is not an easy conversation at all, because we want to make sure that there are equitable practices in place, and we see that there aren't, right? So how are we as an organization partnering with other organizations and other, and academia and other corporations to really push the envelope on this and make sure that our communities are being represented correctly? I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you,
Yes,
Leslie.
thank you.
Nathan, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just gonna, add that we saw that play out after the Merrimack Valley gas disaster, when Columbia Gas was telling people, if you need to go for another solution like an electric heat pump, go for it and we will reimburse you. And so what happened were more affluent households in Andover and North Andover disproportionately were able to do that, and more of the people in Lawrence were left behind. And so that is such an important point that you brought up. We have to do this transition equitably.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And we have time for one more question if anyone has one before we go into our breakout groups. All right. Doesn't look like we do, but thank you for the questions and those responses. What we're going to do now is we're going to go into breakout groups. And I think given the size of this group, Leah, instead of 5-person groups, why don't we make them 4-person groups? You're going to have 10 minutes there, and there's 2 questions that we want you to address, and I will put them in the chat. I should have thought of that before, but I will, after I introduce, I'll put them in the chat. First of all, we want someone to volunteer to be the note taker and then to present back to the group. Oh, thank you, Neha, for putting those questions in the chat. So we want someone to be the note taker and present back to the group. And there's 2 questions. Please make sure you get to both of them. I think actually the second question is the more important question. The first question is, does your organization center climate in your current work? I know that many of you do and some don't. And the second is, what do you need in order to make climate work more central to your work? And that's the one that I want the note taker to sort of encapsulate what people are saying about that. Because where you're all at now is important, but it's really where we're going. So to think about what you would need in order to make climate more central to your work, and try to leave a chunk of those 10 minutes for that question. And if the note taker would mark some of those down, that would be great. Are there any other questions before we go into the breakout room in terms of what we're asking you to do? Great. I look forward to seeing what you all have to say when we come back in 10 minutes and hear from some of you. And in any event, Leah, why don't you go for it? Thank you, Neha. I forgot. Just restart it. You've saved me about 3 times today, so thanks for doing that.
That wasn't me. That had to have been Leah. She's
okay. Thank you, Leah. 2 helpful people helps.
We're a team. We're a team.
So if any, like I said, if folks can just put in there a couple of things, the note takers. Alice, while they're doing that, in response to your question, we're not going to show the workshops at the annual meeting. We have a brief agenda that's going to be for everyone, and then we have some CDC tours. A reminder to folks, if you haven't registered yet and you're interested, please do. You can choose to be in person. And we're going to be, we're going to be careful and require people to be vaccinated and to be masked and have some distance. But if you don't feel comfortable in person, we also have the virtual event. So while people are putting their findings in the chat, we do have about 8 or 9 minutes. So I would ask whoever this can speak for the groups to just share with us verbally what you came up with. And again, I'm more interested in the question about not so much where the organizations are now, but to be more involved. What are the kinds of things that would help you in terms of information, resources, et cetera? So no order. Anybody can please speak up, and we're all ears. Please, Ginger.
Wait. All right, can you hear me? All right. So we just talked about, so it was Dorchester Bay and South Boston NBC. We do have some focus on climate, but both groups would like to do more. One of the things we talked about, though, is having resources to do that. And also maybe how to get started, like a webinar, just talking to groups, how to get started with like community engagement, doing surveys, things like that. We also talked about grant opportunities that might provide some of those resources going forward. But for both of our groups, the Dorchester Bay and South Boston, climate is something we really want to address and make part of our missions. So we just, like, for me, I'm fairly new to this role, so any kind of how-tos, how to get started and what you should do would be great.
Great, thank you, Ginger. Anyone else, please speak up.
I could speak for group 3. So we had Just to Start, NOAA and Community Development Partnership, and me from NeighborWorks America. Obviously, NOAA is way ahead of everybody in this space. So definitely sharing best practices as groups are developing new housing, making them more resilient and looking at the infrastructure. And then also green programming for small businesses was brought up as an opportunity area. Like the previous speaker said, how to create the awareness and do the community engagement work that's needed.
Great, thank you, Lynn. Anyone else? Would love to hear what you have to say.
I'll jump in. Okay, so I was in a group with Leslie from Groundwork Lawrence and Alice from the Massachusetts Housing Partnership and Emily from LISC, L-I-S-C. And a big theme that came out really was about, wanting to be in our organizations more than like cheerleaders for all of the things that we want to get done in terms of decarbonizing our buildings, making our homes and buildings more climate friendly and more climate resilient. But, we need to center the dollars and cents, the financing for the affordable housing. And we talked about whether that could be ARPA dollars, the Recovery Act dollars, the Mass Save program. What are the ways in which we can enhance the funding? And as we do that, and as we build the great amenities like Groundwork Lawrence is doing, how do we make sure that those don't end up pricing people out and causing a gentrification that has bad outcomes for equity and inclusion?
Excellent, thank you, Nathan. And we have time for 1 or 2 more. Is anybody willing to offer? That's okay. If you really would prefer, just keep in the chat, that's fine too. But I do want to give people a chance. Okay, well, to conclude, thank you, everybody. To conclude, I would like to ask each of our three presenters to take a minute or two each to just sort of offer a closing thought to leave us with. I will, in advance of what they say, thank them all. Thanks to Melinda and Latifa from NOAA, to Nathan Phillips from Boston University and HEAT, and to Leslie Melendez from Groundwork Lawrence, also to my colleagues, Neha and Leah, for working with me to bring this to you. So again, in terms of last words, why don't we start with Leslie, and then Melinda, and then Nathan, and then you can all move on with the rest of your day. And thank you all for participating in this discussion. So Leslie, turn it over to you.
Thanks, Don, and thank you to everyone that participated in this conversation today, in this very important conversation. To my fellow presenters, thank you as well. You know, there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot that we need to think about and focus on, but do not lose the voice of the community. They are who is going to lead and guide this work. We need to make sure that we do not lose that voice, that we do not presume to know what they want, what they need, and what they understand. Education is key, but education in a way that folks understand it. So community voice and community education are key, and we can't lose that. And we have to make sure that that is centered in everything that we do as we move forward.
Thank you, Leslie. And thank you everyone for having us. I want to echo what Leslie said. I think as a Latina, this is extremely important. And I would say in my years of organizing, my experience living in Chelsea and working in East Boston, basically, my whole experience of, I apologize. I have a smart TV and sometimes it turns on by itself. It's a little scary. You know, in my years of working in this field, and I unfortunately, you know, living in Chelsea and working in East Boston, gentrification is something that we experience, and it's happening. And you know, it's essential that one of the things that hurts as someone that ensures that we have the community voice and the voiceless are being heard, and that the spaces, the green spaces that we are designing are with them being part of the decision-making process, is that they can't afford to stay. And they created this fun culture that everyone wants to be a part of. Having that said, I think that, you know, we shouldn't choose, it shouldn't be like green and luxury, like that shouldn't be in hand, and it shouldn't be a sacrifice. It's a right, you know, it's a human right. And so that's what we need to make sure, that when we create awareness, we fight that fight with that in mind. You know, and so muchísimas gracias, and thank you for having me. Leslie, I look forward to meeting you in person. Besitos to everyone.
Nathan, you get the last word.
Okay, well, thank you, Dawn and Neha, for organizing this. And thank you, Latifa, Melinda, and Leslie for your wonderful remarks. And I just want to say, like, the work ahead of us is hard work, but hard work is not necessarily complicated work. Hard work can be simple work if we get together in communities, we share our values, we come to the same page, then we can really tackle this. And so I look forward to the connections that we made today, and to work with you all on the things that we all want to see, you know, going forward for affordable housing and clean, resilient housing for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks to everybody. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.